Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. In this video, we are discussing the fever dream that is Star Citizen 1.0, and more specifically, how close we have gotten towards that goal and how much is left. Now, without trying to spoil the entire video here, I will say that the progress hasn't been super outstanding, but there are a couple solid things here and there that we should discuss. Now, before we get into this, if you are enjoying the content and want to keep up with Star Citizen, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I have memberships open if you wanted to go the extra mile, and feel free to join the community Discord. I will have a link for that down below, and I'd love to have you there. Without further ado, though, let's see how close we've progressed towards Star Citizen 1.0. Now, as a bit of a rehash, Star Citizen 1.0 was revealed officially at last year's CitizenCon, roughly 9 months ago. This was over the course of, I think, a 2 hour long presentation looking at everything from what star systems will be in the game, features, and narrative elements. It was a massive presentation to say the least, and that still didn't include everything players were hoping for. Now, as we know, this year has been a year of playability and stability, which, really just means that they are finishing up Squadron and trying to hold us over until that game inevitably releases, though it still has been solid for Star Citizen's quality of life. Now, despite this being a very weird year, though, we are still shooting for that Star Citizen 1.0 goal. And even though the progress is somewhat lackluster, as you will see in this video, doesn't mean there hasn't been some nice small strides along the way. Now, to start this off, we're going to be doing this by looking at the 1.0 release view on the RSI website. I will have a link for this down below if you do want to check it out yourself, but this will consist of multiple different columns of just different aspects of the game, like character, core tech, things like that. And then we're going to go through every card within those columns just to kind of see where they are at. And then for some of these, we will be kind of bunching them together as they haven't seen almost any progress. So there's not much of a reason to go through them individually speaking. Now, I will add that this isn't going to be every single aspect of Star Citizen 1.0. There are actually a handful of cards that just off the top of my head I can think of that just aren't on this list for one reason or the other. Maybe CIG just hasn't gotten around to adding it there, or they forgot. I don't know. There's probably a good chance for both of those reasons. Though I will try to go through everything that I know of today, and if I miss anything, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Now, the first column we have to look at is the character column. This is a very small one, and the only card that is in it is Starware. This card has seen almost zero progress implemented into the PU, similar to a lot of the cards we're going to be talking about today. Most of the info we have on these come from monthly reports and subtle mentions outside of that. It is still very clear that they are working on this one actively behind the scenes, but nothing more than small mentions here and there. As excited as I am for Starware and a more meaningful armor system, this one seems a ways away, and I would go ahead and say we probably aren't seeing this in 2025 at all. Now, I will say it's just kind of like a bit to add a little bit of good news. There was a handful of armor sets they showed off at the Starware presentation last year at CitizenCon that have actually released into the verse over the past, 8 or so months. So that is good news. I'm glad to see that those are in the verse, but just like you kind of expected, they don't have any of the armor stats or any of the benefits that they kind of talked about at that presentation. Though, once again, it's still nice to see some new armor sets, especially ones that were part of that presentation. Now, next up, we do have the core tech column, and to ensure this video isn't incredibly long, we are going to hit a few of these at the same time. Star Sim, Starchitect, Star Audio, Global Illumination, Realistic Audio Mode, Dynamic Server Meshing, and Planet Tech V5 all haven't shown much progress at all. Now, I will say that Ali Brown, one of these senior technical directors, and a few other employees have discussed all of these systems and topics a couple times on Spectrum. Nothing is really noteworthy, unfortunately. For things like Planetech V5, they have been said to be roughly, I think, 75% done, but there really hasn't been much official news on this stuff. I really do appreciate, though, Ali Brown has been kind of amazing at responding to people with questions about a lot of these systems. And to be very clear, he has given us a lot of information as to where they're at and kind of where their progress is kind of heading towards a little bit, but it's nothing that is really worthy of saying, like, hey, this is going to come to the game anytime soon. If anything, it just gives me confidence that when the system does release, it'll be in a pretty solid state. Now, I do think it is pretty clear that when these systems do come online, they will start in a much more controlled area and then spread into more parts of the game. I would expect to see things like global illumination, the new audio systems, and maybe some of the Planet Tech V5 partially implemented this year, though things like Star Sim and dynamic server meshing are, I mean, they're probably like a ways away, just simply due to the sheer size of these types of systems. Now, it isn't all bad news for the Core Tech column, though there are two more cards for Core Tech that include dynamic weather and content instancing. Now, to put it simply, dynamic weather has actually been making it into the game, not just progressing behind the scenes, but we actually have a form of dynamic rain in the game currently, and dynamic snow is actually planned for 4.3. Now, whilst these systems are far from being completed to the full extent that they want them, this is actually something that is seeing progress right now, which is really exciting and is kind of weird because it is something that is a part of the 1.0 call. Now, when it comes to content instancing, there actually hasn't been any progress in terms of actually getting it in game currently, but I do want to say that the next patch 4.3 might be the first time we see this in action as like a small test. As we know, 4.3 will have PvE zones, which would be a great time to test content instancing at a very small scale. This isn't confirmed at all, and it's simply based on my personal speculation, but I simply think that these PvE zones will not live for very long if there isn't some form of isolation or instancing that they use for them. Of course, there could be some other solution out there, but I do think this is a great time to test content instancing. Now, once again, as we move to the gameplay section, we're going to knock out a big group of these cards really quick. And let me tell you, this is a lot of cards, so just get ready, as it's going to take a second. We have ownership, planetary shields, player space stations, player to player trading, citizenship, updated social app for Moby, updated player orgs, hangar upgrades, solar flare, death of a spaceman, reputation V2, updated law and security, insurance, taxes, and warranty, and new player professions have been almost completely void of new information regarding their progress or progress within the game itself. Now, you could argue that tier 0 item recovery is kind of related to insurance, taxes, and warranty, but realistically, there has been very little progress on almost all of these cards. It is unfortunate because if you kind of think about it, a lot of these cards are very, very related to the fundamental aspects of Star Citizen 1.0. A lot of the things that create in game progress and has a ton of really solid social updates, but unfortunately, there just hasn't been much progress on any of these. If we had to bet on one single card that we just said here to actually release to the game within the next, 6 months or so, I would make a bet that it would be Solar Flare, just because that is a very small system compared to most of the other systems within that grouping. Though, once again, I really just don't expect to hear a ton about these in the near future. Hopefully, once Squadron 42 releases, they get a lot of work on these a lot quicker. Now, on the more positive side of things, we have things like Fire Hazard, Charge and Drain, Life Support, Engineering Gameplay, and Location Repair Missions. These are all things that were supposed to release with Alpha 4.0, 7 to 8 months ago. Of course, they did not release at that time, but I think that means that at the very, very least, these systems are very close to being done. And in the game, we just need to get through the rigorous testing of things like engineering and fire hazard stuff. So hopefully, we'll see those in the near future. But at the very, very least, we know that those are pretty close to release. Now, on the other hand, we have things like AI blades, item misfire and wear, vehicle radar and scanning rework, FPS radar and scanning, IFCS and control services, weapon overheat, crafting, base building, guild system, and the updated quantum travel system. All of these are making considerable amounts of progress or are making it into the game in the very near future, as well as some of them are already kind of in the game. Things like AI blades and weapon overheat are partially implemented. And then, of course, we have things like the guild system, which is definitely not in the game technically, but we're getting more missions from these specific guilds. And of course, we have the mercenary and the council scripts. So it's like a different currency for these guilds. It's very bare bones and it's nothing like the official system, but at the very least, it's making it into the game in some way, shape, or form. Then we have things like the IFCS and control services, as well as the updated quantum travel system with quantum boosting. These have not only been talked about a ton over the past 2 months, but we've literally seen things in the files that relate to these, whether that be UI stuff or quite literally, I think in the PTU for 4.2.1, there was like an early work in progress build of the control surface flight model, and someone got to fly that around and test it out a little bit. I will say, despite the sentiment of a lot of these things feeling like they're years away, I will say that these updated flight systems could be a lot closer than we think. Though I'm not going to say anything too soon, probably before the end of the year, maybe early 2026. Of course, then there's also things like crafting and base building, which are obviously going to take a while to get fully implemented, but they are getting work behind the scenes as we've seen from monthly reports. And then everything else that we kind of discussed in here has been talked about in some way, shape, or form, or are starting to slowly get implemented into the game. So I will say is that this handful of cards is a really solid bunch of stuff that could release within the next year or so. But once again, when it comes to Star Citizen and CIG, there's a good chance some of these get delayed. So just take it with a grain of salt. Now, moving on to the location column, we first have to look at the three star systems that are needed for 1.0, that being Nyx, Castra, and Terra. Unfortunately, there has been zero news on these systems. I assume some of the progress needed for these systems is actually being held back by maybe Planet Tech V5 not being completed and similar systems. And as much as I can't wait for another star system, I suspect it will be at the earliest 2026, and I assume it will probably be Nyx. And hopefully, when we do get that star system, they launch a little bit better than Pyro did, though that's, a topic for a whole nother video. I'm just hoping that we see some updates on these star systems for CitizenCon Direct this year. Now, along with this, we also have the guilds that will be a part of 1.0. These have seen basically no progress outside of getting, again, the physical guild scripts. Though I do think it's interesting that these guilds are under the location column. I guess they're going to have a physical location or multiple physical locations around each system. I think that's a pretty interesting idea, but regardless, yeah, we haven't seen much outside of, once again, the physical scripts for just the mercenary and council guilds. Now, the last cards on the location list include utility tunnels and building interiors. Utility tunnels are involved with things like the Area 18's municipal works, and hopefully other landing zones have utility tunnels that have more PvE experiences, but there's no evidence of that releasing to the game anytime soon. And the same thing for building interiors, though this is an extremely vague card. I honestly don't really know exactly what it means, but I think it's referring to things like apartment interiors or maybe just more building interiors at landing zone locations. It is pretty vague, but across the board, we don't have really any updates on them. So I'll go ahead and say they haven't made much progress. And now the last column that we have here is missions and events. This includes the main story, location stories, and station warfare. Each of these have seen quite literally zero progress outside of the actual CitizenCon presentation that they were announced at. So I'm not going to try and sit here and tell you that there's something magically going on in the background that we know about. If there is, they're keeping it under the radar. And as far as we're concerned, there has been no new official information about these three cards. And then, of course, we have cards that are just simply not on the release fee for 1.0 that absolutely should be there for one reason or the other. Things like suit lockers, which should absolutely be there. I mean, they've been talked about for forever now at this point, and we even see pictures with functioning suit lockers. So this is something that absolutely should be there. We have Maelstrom, which has been talked about a ton this year. We have hacking gameplay, which has in fact made some progress this year that we just haven't seen in game at all. And then, of course, there's things like the updated medical system, Bounty Hunting V2, all these big systems and whatnot that have been talked about extensively in the past that are just simply not on the release view. Now, this could be for one reason or the other, probably just because they forgot to add it, or once they kind of get around to talking about it again, they'll add it back to the release view. I don't know. I would hope to see a lot more on the 1.0 release view and at least the nearish future, but the good news is that they at least are adding things onto the 1.0 column as they go. So this is not the finalized list at all. It just is kind of confusing for having things that are so blatantly obvious to have for 1.0 not on the 1.0 release view. So for whatever reason, they're not there, but hopefully as we go, they will be added there and hopefully just added to the game. And then there are, of course, things that were added to the game that weren't necessarily on the release view. They might have been, I'm not entirely sure, but a lot of these are bigger items for 1.0. We have Radiation and the Apex Valakar and all the Valakars. Those are definitely big items that I didn't necessarily expect to get this soon, but are absolutely something you would see for the 1.0 vision of Star Citizen. And then, of course, we have like all these sandbox locations. We have all the events and activities that we've been getting this year, just basically all the content. And I'm not going to pretend like it's the most replayable content in the world or it's the most enjoyable experiences because without some of the features and systems we talked about here, it definitely isn't. But what I will say is I think it does create a really solid foundation for the future of content for Star Citizen 1.0. So taking a step back and looking at the progress that has been made over the past 9 or so months since that CitizenCon, presentation, I would go ahead and say it is, like, 1% of what we need for 1.0, and that's not a dig at CIG or anything like that. I think that's just being realistic about what is planned for 1.0 and what we currently have. I think behind the scenes, they actually have a whole lot more that they are working on when it comes to the end goal of 1.0. It's just not stuff that's either ready to be shown or ready to be implemented into the game yet. So it might take a lot of time, and they absolutely need to get Squadron out the door before they have this really strong push on Star Citizen. But I do think we are headed in the right direction, even if the progress has been extremely minimal. And that is going to do it for this video today. I do appreciate you watching and sticking around to the end. I know this is a lot of rambling about, different features and systems, but it is a lot of fun to kind of just look at where we are at. And I would love to hear your thoughts. Are you disappointed? Are your expectations surpassed? Or are you just kind of coasting along? Regardless of what it is, I would love to hear it down below. Again, thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video. I would love to make an update in about 6 months once we get to, past CitizenCon towards the start of 2026. And hopefully at that point, I have some better news when it comes to progress. Though, regardless, I am still looking forward to whatever is to come next for Star Citizen. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video.